Chris Slovak is VP of Global Sales Solutions at Telium. He serves as a key technical advisor, helping customers and potential customers understand how Telium's real-time customer data solutions can help solve their unique digital marketing challenge. Welcome, Chris. Over to you.
All right, thank you. Excited to kick this off. I think our last big webinar of the year as we all round out the year into the holidays. I'm really excited to talk about this subject. It's been a really fun concept to talk about in the last few quarters here. And so what we're going to talk about is sort of first and foremost the 5 factors that are changing the way that brands need to think about customer experience, and more importantly, out of those factors that are changing things, what we as business professionals need to do, what those mandates are in order to be successful. We're going to talk a little bit about personalization stages, 360 views, and really more how do we do customer data orchestration, and then talking about some recommendations on how you move forward. And then, of course, as Megan mentioned, we're going to have some Q&A. So it's going to be a great day. Let's go ahead and dive right in and jump first to the 5 factors that are really driving consumer experience, right? The 5 factors that are driving this digital transformation. And I think the first one we have to recognize is that the experiences that consumers have are almost and sometimes more important than the product itself. And I think the best example of this would be livery services. Anybody who's ever traveled has gotten into a cab in New York City, and it's a pretty gross experience. You never know if the cab's going to make it to the destination. And, at the end of the day, though, getting from A to B has been around for a long time. But Uber and Lyft showed up and sort of really revolutionized the experience. Right? It's not about getting from A to B. It's about how it feels getting to A to B. No more hailing cabs, no more smelly cabs and cars that are falling apart because they can be rated, right? It's more transparent. This disruption is really happening across the space. We're seeing not only in transportation and established industries like banking and payment services, but food and fashion, the way we shop, everything is really changing. These disruptors have focused on building great experiences for consumers, and they've done that because they put the customer at the center. They empathize with who the customer is, what their interests are, and have a mandate around driving this concept of customer at the center, right? They use data, not opinions. They invest heavily into the experience itself, and they're always willing to test, learn, and adjust. And so the first mandate that we have driving from this concept that the experience is as important or equal to the product is that the customer has to be at the center. The experience for that customer has to be just as important, if not sometimes more important, than what you're actually giving them as a service provider. Okay, so the second big factor we have to talk about is that experience itself, the moment that this experience happens. And when you look at it and you empathize it from the consumer's perspective, they don't really think about channels and campaigns and devices. And I'm a big nerd when it comes to Patagonia, big brand fan. And for me, it doesn't really matter what touch point I have with the brand. It's just Patagonia. It's just the experience. It's how I relate to the brand. And if you think about our digital sort of world and digitally enabled world, the data of each of those touch points, that is the language of the relationship. It actually is the language of the moment. It enables the brand to figure out what type of context that I'm in. And I think we think about context, we have to think about stage, and everyone likes to talk about personalization. Personalization isn't necessarily about driving conversions, about driving value to the customer. And you have to think about what message you want to apply to a customer based on what stage you're in, right? And I think one of the things that we see out there is that everybody's trying to create one-on-one messages 100% of the time, but that might not necessarily be appropriate. You have a core brand. You have a core brand message. It's important. When you're trying to do outreach to people you've never met, you want to focus on creating these brand experiences, right, that drive that core message. And as you get to know somebody and you get to understand exactly what their interest is, and you use data because you've tracked and you've sort of paid attention to all the interactions that users had, then you can get to one-to-one communication. So in the case in point, Patagonia does a fantastic job in my world of showing me the sort of activities that I care about. In this case, you see me out on Lake Tahoe. But I don't get messaging about, rock climbing, because I don't do that anymore. And that tailored experience where they're providing me value throughout my journey with them as a life cycle, not necessarily just someone that they're trying to convert, is a really interesting concept, right? And when you think about the practice of personalization, and this is from a Telium presenter, Sav from Possible. I highly recommend you reach out to him. But he has a concept that is determining based on your business, right, where your ROI is. And so I'll give you a couple of really good examples here, right? When we talk about this idea of personalization, we talk about whether or not the message should be a core brand message versus a one-on-one message. If you're a CPG and your data footprint that is first-party, experience-driven, right, data that you've collected about a consumer based on your touch points, is very low because you're sitting out there on the Kroger shelf, and you don't get to have a lot of that one-to-one data set. You don't really get that ability to have that one-to-one messaging or that one-to-moment messaging because you don't have the data. You don't know the context. So you have to rely on your sort of full branding, right? You have to talk about your core message, the one-to-many, right, and drive that brand narrative home. Whereas the kind of flip side of that is something like Telium, right? We're a B2B, and in more than one conversation that we have is multiple people in organizations. They become customers. We know that if they need help versus their perspective, we can have one-to-one conversations because we have a lot of one-to-one interactions, right? We have an understanding of who that consumer is, and we understand the relationship up until this point. So creating an in-the-moment conversation based on the data up until this point enables us to have conversations versus campaigns. And I think that's where we summarize this concept, right? Personalization, when we talk about it, isn't about conversions and conversions and conversions. It's about driving value to customers. It's listening and understanding the context that they're in, using the data that you've collected through the experiences that you've had, and deciding whether or not you want to tell them what they want to hear versus what you want to say. And I think as we kind of look forward in the future in a world where the experience is as important, or if not greater than the product, understanding the conversation that the customer wants to hear is kind of that mandate. And moreover than that, all of these moments, they're happening in real time. So gathering these insights, understanding them, and then deciding whether or not you're using your core message versus a one-on-one message, right, and then actually delivering that responsiveness, these are all things that you have to harness real-time data and real-time activity for. It's just the way moments happen. They're fleeting. So mandate number 2, moments of real time, and that kind of drives us into this next big factor, which is that the data that's fueling all of these moments and all of this decision-making and letting us know what the context is, it is an absolute business asset. And it demands sort of a completely different approach than is being had today. And I love the 360-degree view conversation to sort of highlight this. So most organizations have, some kind of 360-degree view project. And for me, interestingly enough, when I hear 360 view, all I can think about is a protractor when I was doing my geometry 3rd grade class. And I actually had a business partner of mine say to me that she thinks about it as a symphony, right? There's this 360-degree kind of concept of how an experience that a consumer really should have. And I thought about that. If I'm a customer and I want to have a 360-degree experience, I want to have a contextual conversation with a brand based on where I am in sort of that moment. well, what does that look like from a data perspective? What does that look like from a 360 view? And if I'm sitting in a symphony and I'm sitting in one of the seats out there, you're just surrounded by this beautiful music. And up on stage, there's, clearly a whole variety of different instruments, but they're working cohesively and they're creating this experience that's all encompassing. And then you've got, the conductor at the front, and he's got his little wand and he's waving it. And of course, he's the one who's making all these instruments work, and it's all sort of magic, and he's the conductor. But the reality is that that's not quite the case, right? You have sections of orchestras. You have a team of people using the same instrument working in concert to provide this experience. And what are they reading off of? They're reading off of sheet music. Now, if anyone's a musician out there, yes, the violinists and the cellists and the percussionists all have different sheet music. But really what's happening is the conductor's telling everybody where we are in time, right? Maybe everyone's data set is a little different, and their sheet music is a little different, but they're giving us context. The conductor is giving us context on where we are, and what the musicians are doing is interpreting that point in time, interpreting the sheet music, right, the data, and making a decision on how to create their part of the experience. So if we take that sort of simile and we look at it from our world and we break down an anatomy and experience in the digital landscape, we have all these interactions that infer the persona, the individual. We should be moving that data to the teams and the tools who can decide, right, what message to prevent at that sort of point in time based on that context and that touch point, which will create this all-encompassing 360-degree view, 360-degree experience. Because that's really what matters. It's the experience, not the view. It's not I have all of the data. It's that this person feels as if the context and the conversation is relevant to them in that moment, right? So when we break down 360, it's not the view. The view isn't really what we're going for. It gives us insight, and we need to build a 360 degree data set. But without that activation, it's pretty worthless. So this approach today that we have, which is go out, grab all the data from the silos, dump it all in a warehouse, get a view, and then what? Figure it out. It needs to be replaced with the concept of data orchestration, or really center out data distribution, right? And of course, Telium, we believe that we can do these as CDPs, but at the center, right, aggregate your data, build your sort of cohesive data set out, and then push it to the edge where the teams who are doing the targeting, do the messaging, they can interpret the data and create the experience so that the consumer, regardless of what touch point they have next, they feel an in the moment cohesive experience, right? We want to empower teams and tools with data. And that concept of making sure that the data is an asset to the organization means that the business has a mandate to have the correct access and ownership. And access, I mean enabling and breaking down silos by pushing data out to where it matters, where it can be used in the teams and the tools that you've already selected, right? Having freedom within the organization, structure to it that is in a taxonomy for the business. And of course, there are business and strategy requirements here. And I think that this is a people and tech scenario that you have to consider, right? The business has to say strategically, we want to manage our data, and we'll go source technology to do that. But the technology and the data set should empower team to create competitive advantages using the data that you've collected up to this point, right, to understand what the moment is, and then of course provide that great experience, right? Kind of going back to mandates 1 and 2. Now, we're getting down into the data, which means we have to start talking about governance. It's a little bit of a boring subject, and probably everyone's sick of hearing about it with GDPR this year, but we have to talk about it. It's important, right? Because data is plural for datum. It means that it's something given to you, right? When your consumer is interacting with you or prospective consumer, they're giving you data. And their expectations sometimes are a little bit at odds with what the brand has from a goal perspective or a privacy regulatory perspective. And so this sort of positioned this sort of intersection of experience and customer expectations and brand needs and goals, that data has really been subject to a lot of precursors to massive change, right? We've had a lot of advocacy groups talking about protecting consumers, the walled gardens, the Googles, the Apples, the Facebooks of the world, making it more secure for you to use their services. And then on the other side of this, like the brands have the regulators forcing their hand in what they can and can't do. And then, of course, internally, and many of you probably have felt this, where your own teams are concerned with, data governance or data security, right? So it's no wonder with all these precursors to change and this sort of juxtaposition of data against consumers and brands that we have a very, very active regulatory landscape right now. And I think if we look at this problem from I'm going to get sued and I just need to protect the company perspective, I think we're looking at it wrong, frankly. Because when I give something to a brand, I expect a value exchange there. I expect good experiences and great products because I'm engaging with that brand and I'm telling them what kind of experience I want. And it shouldn't be the brand that's just worried about getting sued. They should look at it from a perspective of trust. They should empathize with their customer, and they should consider what that individual is expecting of them. And I think that building that brand trust kind of does a couple things. Number one, we all know, and there's many studies been done that if there's a known value exchange, people will continue to work in it. And moreover than that, right, people buy from brands they trust, and they tell other friends to buy from brands they trust. So as brand marketers and as data professionals, we should simply use empathy to make sure that we can continue to maintain trust. And I use a sort of joke, which is like, what would grandma say? My grandmother always asked me, and right around the holidays is a great time to think about this, like, what do you do, Chris? If I have to explain it to her and she looks at me with sort of disdain because she thinks I'm creepy and we're tracking everything on the internet, I probably haven't done it in a way that provides empathy. I haven't thought about how she would think about what I do with her data. And so it's a little cheesy, but what would grandma say about what you're doing with her information? Use that as a sort of guide point in empathy to determine whether or not you're doing something that really is providing value, right, to the customer. And if you do that, data governance becomes easy, in my opinion. And I think, of course, that's mandate number 4. Data governance is pretty straightforward. And yes, we have to have compliance with regulatory reasons. But at the end of the day, we should really think about empathy and building trust, and doing so by practicing good governance. And of course, that means clarity and transparency of use. It's providing your consumers rights to their data, right? It's having the proper controls in place so that it's not misused. These are all things that you've heard of many, many times before, but I want you to think about it in the light of empathy and trust, not so much of business and legal risk, okay? The opportunity for the business to, frankly, take advantage and build more brand. Now, last but not least, we've got experiences driving good, are becoming part of the product. We're using data in the moment to drive those experiences. We're thinking about the data as an asset internally, making sure that we provide and have governance over it. And factor number 5 really is there just is too much data. I just recently read that there's something like 155 zettabytes of data being created every year, which is just outrageous. It's just too much for a human to comprehend. And moreover than that, we've only really hit about 50% of penetration in the world. Now, I would argue that that's enough to sort of put ubiquitous internet on the map. I always joke, I wish I had put it in the deck. There's this awesome viral video floating around where some guy's doing the dance where he gets out of the car and does the dance and jumps back in the car, but he's doing it with his oxen in a rice field somewhere in India. And I mean, if somebody like that has an iPhone and they're still working with livestock to till their crops, and they've got an iPhone to take a viral video, I would argue we've hit ubiquitous internet, right? We're there, and that sort of internet minute day is this sort of slide just gets crazier and crazier, right? They're just frankly, because of this, is too much data. And of course, well, what is going to arise to sort of solve that is, data science, right? And I think there's a kind of, everyone thinks that when they hear data science, it's like, oh my God, this is such a brand new thing. And really, there's been flavors of it for a long time. And many of you who are on this line probably have worked with analytics or statistics and data mining before. Where I think it gets really interesting to deal with all of this data is in the sort of the AI space, in particular in our space, machine learning and others, deep learning. But before we can just say, oh, well, the machines will do it all and we don't have to do anything, I think we have to take a little trip down memory lane and remember that sometimes, and this just recently happened with another example, sometimes we have to consider things like data bias. We have to, as people, recognize that there is a story to be had, and it's a personal story, and the machines themselves aren't going to just figure it all out. The set it and forget is a bad idea. And if anyone remembers Tay, this was an experiment by Microsoft in which they put basically a bot, an AI bot that was a chat bot, on Twitter. And within 24 hours, it was, reminiscent of something from the Terminator movies. I mean, it was really scary. And this problem has actually just recently happened with NASA. They put up, I don't know if you remember this, but they put a bot, you should read about it. They put a bot up on a little device floating in space, and it decided that it didn't want to change the music within the first hour of being turned on, right? The computer turned on its host really quickly. And so while ML, AI, deep learning, these are clearly ways that humans can handle big data that we can't handle, we have to be a little bit concerned and considerate, right, as we move forward. We have to go boldly but tread lightly. We can't just assume that we can set and forget everything, right, because these systems are only going to be good as the data they get, right? So collection bias is something we have to consider. The overcommitment of humans and expectations that intuition goes away is a bad idea. And moreover than that, if you tell a machine to go from A to B, it goes from A to B. But sometimes the human element, the brand, the storytelling can get lost, right? And so, we as brand marketers and analysts, we have to do our best to utilize these tools, make sure that our data and our company is ML and AI ready, right? But we have to consider that we are the managers of the brand. We have to use the insights. We have to be able to interpret and listen to those insights, be sort of data-driven, but also make sure that we're still considering the brand story, right? As we round the corner here and we get into a review, first and foremost, the sort of big thing that I'm seeing in this space is that the experience is equal and sometimes greater than the product itself, which drives the need for us to have customer at the center as a mandate in the business. Those experiences are built up of moments, and the moment really matters, and the context of who that user is and what you know about them up until that point in real time is what's relevant in creating the experience. And so businesses have a mandate, even if they feel like they're not ready for real time, they have to prepare themselves for that. Data is the fuel of the language. It's the language of the relationship. It's the language of who these users are. It is itself a business asset. The first-party data that you collect through these experiences has to have complete ownership in the organization, and it needs to have focus. But more importantly, the distribution, the orchestration, the access of that data set and those insights need to be available at the edge where teams and tools can evaluate them, not just in some central place that's locked behind a door. Because we're collecting all this data and we're using it to create these experiences, we have to ensure that the business thinks about governance and trust across the board. It has to be, privacy as a design is part of what we need to do, not just because of the regulatory implications, but because of the brand trust implications. And last but not least, as we move forward, recognizing how important data is and that there is just so much of it, we have to enable our businesses to be ready to handle ML and AI, right? We need the business to be accepting of the data, use the insights, but do so making sure that the data that we're sending into these algorithms is as scrubbed as bias as possible, and that we don't get into a situation where we have magic expectations of set it and forget it and I don't have to do anything, because that would effectively remove the human element, which is the storytelling, and that's important if we go all the way back up to the first thing, which is that the experience is as important as the product, right? It's humans and machines, it's technology and people and process that will make you successful in the next sort of digital revolution. So thank you so much for the time. Hopefully we had some good insights in there, and I think what we'll do is we'll leave it open for some Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. All right. If you have any questions, please use the Ask a Question feature, and we'll start going over them. All right. First question. For the first mandate, you recommended to test, learn, and adjust. What's the best way to get started doing this?
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, I think you have to look at that from a perspective of tools, people, and process. So it's kind of dependent on what your job is. I've seen, there's a lot of tools out there that, will actually help you do content testing. This is your classic content optimization, multivariate testing tools. And then, of course, if you're in more of the paid media side of the house, there's tools that you can test different creatives. You can test different messaging. I think, though, outside of the tool set, it's just a general process and attitude that you're never finished with a product, right? We always say Telium, it's not the destination, it's a journey. And if you have that attitude internally, that's the first step. I think the other big thing that you have to do before you try to jump into the test, learn, and adjust as a philosophy, and I see this far too often in more traditional businesses where no one wants to fail. They don't want to be the failure. But in a business that is test, learn, adjust, failure is going to happen. You're going to try something that's going to fail miserably, and that's okay. That has to be something that senior management agrees to right out of the gate, right? If they don't, no one will really want to test anything. So yeah, I think you've got to approach getting the organization around that sort of first concept, which is it's okay to fail, and then you become an organization that can move into a process, which is how do we organize ourselves to have a journey and never an end destination. We never really close a project out. And then third becomes the tech. Go find some tech that can help you.
Great. Thank you. All right. Next question. Looks like it's around data governance. Do I need to ensure every vendor in my MarTech stack is adhering to these rules? And how do I ensure compliance?
I'm not a lawyer, so I want to be careful with ensuring compliance. However, there's a lot of materials in the market today that will help you understand what you need to get your vendors to do. And in the case of GDPR, there's model clauses that you can add into your contracts. So that's kind of how you deal with sort of the compliance side of it. I think if you think about data governance, there's some sort of golden rules, if you will, consent and transparency of data collection and use. And then rights of the data subjects to understand what you've collected, where it's going, and they want to be able to get it, port it, or delete it. So you kind of have those first things covered, which you should do in being empathetic to your customers anyways. You're in good shape. And then in terms of that specific question, would you like, do I have to ensure every vendor in your stack? Yes and no. And what I mean yes and no is if there are technological solutions, Telium being one of them, but there are others that can actually act as sort of data traffic cops, right? And so you can kind of thwart off a situation where you might be in trouble. So I'll give you an example. Maybe you have a vendor that only can do data storage in the U.S., which would directly be against German law. Then you might actually use a tag management tool or an API hub tool like Telium's products to not send data to that vendor in the scenario that consumer was directed from Germany, as a very specific example. But there's a lot of tools out there that can help you with some of that.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And thank you, Chris, for your time and your presentation.